the SEC West in 2020 produced us two playoff caliber teams, I would argue, along with a national title in the 2020 Alabama Crimson Tide, who could be put up with the likes of some of the greatest teams of all time. Things look to possibly be similar in the 2021 SEC West this year, but we never know. Today we are going to be discussing the 2021 SEC West schedule predictions. I'm going to be mentioning a thing or two that I like and dislike about each team as we go along the list, from worst in the division to first in the division, and I am also going to be discussing these teams' ceilings and floors. So let's get right into it. And first off, you have in last place of the SEC, a shocker for many, the Auburn Tigers. Now I know what you're going to be thinking here. How can we pick a team that has won a national title in the past just over a decade, and a team that constantly contended for the SEC and got close to beating Alabama and even beat Alabama several times in the past decade? Well, I think the firing of Gus Malzahn was A, it was an absolute mistake, and B, you're going to really feel the repercussions with hiring a new head coach in the SEC. We have seen several times, really, with the exception of Gus Malzahn, you hire a first-year head coach in the SEC, and it's tough. It's a tough first year, unless you're like Les Miles, who inherited Nick Saban's recruiting class at LSU, and there's always other exceptions. But even Kirby Smart, who's proven himself, had a tough first year at Georgia, even after succeeding Mark Richt, who recruited well and who consistently won like 10 games a year. So I'm not saying Brian Harsin's a bad head coach or that Auburn just stinks. What I'm saying is the SEC West and the SEC in general, outside of Vanderbilt and South Carolina and Tennessee, but mainly the SEC West, is so good, especially the West recently, so good with loaded, proven coaches, innovative coaches, that even the good ones will have terrible looking seasons on paper with record. And I think Auburn falls in this place because you have a first-year head coach. Every other school in the SEC West does not have a first-year head coach, which means they've had time to establish themselves, and they've all proven themselves in one way or another. Ed Orgeron won a national title. Sam Pittman won a couple conference games when no one thought they would do that. Mike Leach has built trash into treasure at Washington State and Texas Tech. Lane Kiffin is known to be innovative. Jimbo Fisher won a national title, and Nick Saban's the GOAT. And Brian Harsin came from the Mountain West to coach in the most prominent and powerful division in the entire country. Nonetheless, I have them beating Akron, Alabama State, barely losing to Penn State and Happy Valley, and beating Georgia State. But then they will go on a sad 5-game losing streak to LSU, Georgia, Arkansas, Ole Miss, and A&M. But they will beat Mississippi State and South Carolina. Mississippi State for the home field advantage and the air raid. We'll get more on the Mississippi State part later, because I think Mississippi State's an interesting team this year. South Carolina, I just think, will be in complete and utter disarray next year, despite being better than the previous year. So that's why I have Auburn beating them. And then Auburn, there's no way I see them beating Alabama this year. They will finish 5-7, 2-6 in conference. Their floor, I think, is this 5-7 record. I think it would be much harder for a coach like Brian Harsin, who does return a hefty amount of starters. I believe 16, 9 on offense, including the quarterback and Tank Bigsby, very talented running back. And you got Derek Mason as the DC with 7 returning starters. They can't get lower than 5-7. Their ceiling is 8-4. They could definitely contend to being a top 25 team by the end of the season. I have no doubts about that. So Auburn, last place in my projections, and next up you have Arkansas. Now Arkansas is interesting because Arkansas certainly has the lower floor. They don't have the talent that Auburn has, and some could argue they might have worse or equal coordinators, definitely have worse talent, and their head coach does not have the same track record. However, they do have the advantage in the fact that they're established for a year and they return 2 more starters. The only issue is, of course, the defense, allowing 5 touchdowns a game last year, which is something I don't like. But the returning starters, having Kendall Briles as an OC is something that is to be proud of. They do need better play as they allowed 34 sacks last fall, and they do need to replace Felipe Franks. But again, I think Arkansas is a team that last year proved it's not completely dead. It has a pulse, and I hope Sam Pittman can bring them back into the fold. But for now, I have to go with what I see. And without Felipe Franks, I see a 5-7 record with a win against Rice, a possible win against Texas, but for now I have to go with the loss here. A win at Georgia Southern, losses to A&M, Georgia, and Ole Miss. They will beat Auburn at home, and they almost beat Auburn away last year. They will face Arkansas, Pine Bluff. That'll be an easy win against an FCS opponent. Again, another loss for Mississippi State, another win for Arkansas. And at this point, they will be 5-4, and they could go bowling. They have a better chance to go bowling, I'd say, looking at the last season run than Auburn does, simply because their last game will be against an easier opponent. But I think they lose all 3 to LSU, Alabama, and Missouri to finish 5-7, 2-6, technically tied for 6th with Auburn, but that head-to-head win will put them at 6th. Their floor is 3-9. I could totally see them, for some reason, going winless in conference. Very possible here. And I think their ceiling would be 7-5. I think at most, with what Sam Pittman has to work with, at most Arkansas could be an 8-5, 7-6 team, which would be impressive, especially if one of those losses is to Texas. And then you probably have a 4-4 SEC record, which would be very good for the Razorbacks. And next up, you do have the LSU Tigers, led by national champion winning coach Ed Orgeron. And speaking of that national title, I am now kind of on this train that Ed Orgeron needs to prove himself already again after last year. And I don't think he will. And that may come off as, you know nothing, opinion immediately invalidated here, but guys, I get that they had like NFL, all their players from 2019 were in the NFL. They had some opt-outs. You can't go 5-5 and have an abysmal, a defense that is as bad as Michigan's in 2020. You can't have that and have my respect. It's impossible. Youth is not an excuse. And I know COVID is weird, but injuries, opt-outs, and if you collapse as a result of those along with NFL draft talent, you are incapable of reloading. And reloading is what great teams do. I look at LSU, and now I do like the fact that they hired a new OC who is bringing back more of that 2019 offense, and they immediately got rid of Pelini. So they're aware of their faults and trying to fix them. That's what's going for them, their ability to adapt. But I look at next year and I see just the fact that I think they'll beat UCLA and McNeese State and Central Michigan, but the air raid will be established at Mississippi State. Everyone in the West, and I'm going to reinforce this point, is getting better. Everyone's getting better at the same time, which means even teams that could destroy in other conferences are really going to suffer on paper in the SEC West. Mississippi State, I think, will be another upset. It'll keep Mike Leach's job security. After that, LSU will start out in total 5-1, and they'll probably look good in plenty of these games. They'll beat Auburn. They'll win at a solid Kentucky team. That'll probably be their best win of the entire year besides UCLA. I don't see them beating Florida. Granted, LSU definitely is the team that returns more starters, 9 on defense, including, an absolute stud in Derek Stingley. And you do have a pretty good quarterback competition on offense and very proven talent, constant top 5 recruiting classes. But I look at what Dan Mullen is doing, and Dan Mullen, I believe, is a great X's and O's coach, and I think he'll win this game. It'll be a close game, but I think he wins. At Ole Miss and at Bama will be very tough. Those will be tough games. They will beat Arkansas and Louisiana Monroe before falling again to Texas A&M to finish 7-5 and 3-5 on the year and 5th in the SEC West. Their floor, I think, is 6-6. I don't think they could lose very much more than 7-5. The UCLA game and the Kentucky game are losable, but besides that, I don't think they could go lower than 6-6. Their ceiling is very high. This team could prove me wrong, and they could go 10-2 out of nowhere. Now, I know a lot of people are having them in their top 25, but for them to go 10-2 would still shock a good amount of people. To go 10-2, they'd probably only lose to Alabama or A&M and beat everyone else, including Florida and Ole Miss, who will likely be top 25 teams when they are faced by LSU. Again, LSU has the talent, the willingness to adapt and fix their errors. You got Jake Peets as the OC, and you fired Pelini. So LSU wants to head in the right direction. They have the talent to do so. Ed Orgeron, I don't think, is a bad head coach. I'm just not saying he is an elite head coach. What's going against them, I think, is just what happened last year. There were some locker room issues. There were other issues. But I look at what happened last year, like it was awkward almost, and I just don't have a good feeling about them. That's my main reason behind this. But again, they could prove me wrong, and they could go 10-2. After LSU, you have Mississippi State. Now, Mississippi State is going to be probably a shorter discussion because now we're getting into these teams that everyone is kind of expecting to fall into this range. Mississippi State is one of those teams who is going to play it close with the great teams, not the Alabamas though, but the Texas A&Ms, the Kentuckys, the LSUs, the Ole Misses. They will cause them issues. This is what Mike Leach does. Mike Leach loses to the teams like Auburn and Arkansas, and then like last year how we saw against Georgia, only lost to them by a touchdown. This is what Mike Leach does. It's chaos, and that's what Ole Miss will be. Now, not Ole Miss, Mississippi State. Now, Mississippi State they're ranked top 10 in the FPI, which I think is asinine, period, amen. But they're also unranked by almost everyone else of people. Mississippi State will be interesting because I think they will start out 4-0 and they will beat LSU again. Now, that's a lot of momentum, and we know how momentum affects college football games. It's part of the reason I have LSU going 7-5. A loss again to Mississippi State would be it'd be debilitating and humiliating to that entire program. Same with a Mississippi State loss to LSU, in my opinion, because of how Mike Leach is always under pressure, it seems. But after LSU, I think they'll lose to A&M and Alabama. They'll crush Vanderbilt. They'll lose to Kentucky, Arkansas, and Auburn, which will have a lot of people doubting Mike Leach. But he'll win against Tennessee State to get bowl eligibility, and I think they upset the Ole Miss Rebels here to finish 7-5, 3-5, 4th in the SEC West. Their floor is the second lowest in the entire division. We know how air raid teams are. You have to be patient with Mike Leach. Then again, this team could go 9-3. They could beat the Auburns and the Arkansas of this world and simply lose to some good teams while still upsetting another good one or two. After Mississippi State, you have Lane Kiffin's Ole Miss. And before we get to them, I just want to say that one thing I like about Mississippi State is the air raid and the fact that Mike Leach has time to establish it. He has a proven track record. They have been recruiting better. You have to understand with the air raid, it takes time to adapt to that scheme. And also, Mike Leach here has a pretty modest plethora of 16 returning starters and a full offseason to work with. Now, the defense is poised to take a step forward as well, and that's a good thing. The issue is, again, turnovers like last year. It seems like the quarterbacks last year, mainly Costello, really struggled and cost their team plenty of games last year. There needs to be improvement on the offensive side, mainly with the air raid. But with Ole Miss, I think Ole Miss is a solid team as long as they improve defensively. One of my concerns with Ole Miss is the defense. Another concern is the fact that Matt Corral can be a seemingly Heisman contender in one game, and then the next game he's chucking picks everywhere. So Corral needs to be more consistent if Ole Miss wants to be an SEC West contender. But Matt Corral did very well last year for being I believe a first-time starter. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But they do open up against Louisville and Austin Peay and Tulane. I think all of those will be wins. They will lose to Alabama, but then they will beat Arkansas, Tennessee, LSU, Auburn, and Liberty. At this point, they will be 8-1. And at 8-1, Ole Miss will certainly be ranked in the top 15 if this happens. But they will lose to A&M, beat Vanderbilt, and then be upset by Mississippi State to finish 9-3, 5-3 in conference, and third in their division. And what Ole Miss has going for them is also what's a concern. It's Matt Corral and the entirety of the offense. Their two leading receivers also graduated and were drafted, I believe. So you also have to keep that in mind. You're going to have new receivers step up, and their defense was abysmal. They had Ole Miss was literally Florida with a slightly worse offense and defense, which cost them their entire season. That's what Ole Miss was last year, was the 2020 Florida Gators with less talent and probably more chaos because first-year head coach. Again, that's a huge factor in the SEC West, is being a first-year head coach or an experienced head coach. After Ole Miss, you have A&M, but Ole Miss's floor is 6-6. They could implode, but their ceiling is 10-2. Similar situation to LSU. I just favor Lane Kiffin here. A&M we're finally at the teams where their floors are basically being a fringe top 25 opponent. A&M, I look at A&M, I look at how last year their defense actually came in clutch and won them games. They had the 9th strength of record. Jimbo Fisher had 1 loss. And this season, now pardon me if this sounds insane, in 2012, E.J. Manuel left Florida State, was drafted. They went 12-2. They entered the next season as underdogs for the ACC championship game. Clemson was favored. Jameis Winston was a freshman. Jameis Winston kicked butt that season, and they finally got to an undefeated regular season. A&M, to me, sounds like a similar story next year. You return Anais Smith, Isaiah Spiller, Devin Achane, who are 3 potent running backs. You also return, the majority of everyone else besides the offense, which you still return 6 and return 9 on defense. 9 defensive returning starters on the 28th scoring defense last year, again, in the hardest division, is quite impressive. I think that A&M will prove themselves early on. Their matchup with Alabama will be an undefeated battle. It'll be similar to the 2013 game, score-wise, and how it's kind of back and forth. Alabama will dominate at points. A&M will rally back. I think Alabama wins because I have faith in Saban, and I honestly think that Saban will likely, as long as he isn't falling off, Saban will be undefeated against his former assistants, and that gives Alabama the edge here, along with Alabama's just, again, superior talent and superior coaching staff. I think we'll get to Alabama's coaching staff later. But after the Alabama loss, A&M will actually stay together, unlike the Kevin Sumlin seasons where they would match Alabama in the top 10 and collapse. A&M follows last year's trend. They lose to Bama, they're going to win out. Going to beat Missouri, they're going to crush South Carolina and Auburn like a truck running over an empty Coke can. That's what those games are going to be like. Ole Miss will be a closer game for sure, but it will still be a win. Prairie View A&M will be a blowout, and LSU, it could be a revenge game for the 2019 blowout that occurred there. A&M's floor is 9-3. Their ceiling, and I'm saying this again because of what Jimbo did in 13, they have the potential to go undefeated. They could beat Alabama and somehow win the SEC West. It's unlikely, but ceilings and floors normally for second, third place teams are normally unlikely because they have the talent and they have some stuff to get to the top, but they rarely do. It's kind of like with Michigan and Penn State. They totally have the talent to kick butt in their divisions, and they never do. So Texas A&M could do this, but I think Alabama takes it here, and that's where we're going to go with Alabama. By the way, A&M, there's not much to not like about this team besides Jimbo being a former assistant of Saban, which kind of dooms their chances for the championship game. There's not much to dislike about next year's A&M team. Only concern could be quarterback with Mond departing, but Mond was never an absolute baller, game-changer quarterback from what I understood. He was good last year with turnovers, but he didn't throw more than 19 touchdown passes, only ran for 4. Mond, to me at least, he wasn't like a Joe Burrow or like a Justin Fields, if you know what I'm saying. Great quarterback, not like even like a Cam Newton who carries an entire team on his back. He fit well within the system, so it's not to be a huge concern for Kellen Mond to leave. Good quarterback. Not criticizing him when I say that. I'm just saying A&M can get the job done with a different guy. Alabama is who is next up, and Alabama here. I look at Alabama and I think, oh my goodness, undefeated. Complete, utter. They're gonna repeat from last year. That's my prediction. They're gonna repeat, and I think they will win the Heisman again because despite only 3 offensive returning starters, which is again like A&M, you don't have much concerns here. But their only concern, Alabama-wise, is their entire offense basically got drafted. The ones who left. But Bryce Young got some play time, and I think he's pretty solid. Bill O'Brien, people were criticizing this hire. It's like, look what he did with Penn State. And look what he even did at the Texans before he tried too much, like what Saban said. Bill O'Brien, that's a good hire. I don't care what you say. That man is going to continue the offensive renaissance in Tuscaloosa. Bill O'Brien will lead probably, again, one of the top offenses in the country. Alabama will beat Miami, Mercer, likely beat Florida, though that game could be closer than many anticipate. Beat Southern Miss, beat Ole Miss, beat A&M, beat Mississippi State, Tennessee, LSU, Mississippi, New Mexico State, Arkansas, and Auburn. Alabama will go 12-0, and they will be representing the SEC West in the championship game, no doubt. Their floor is 11-1, and I think that'd be losing in an upset to a team like Florida, Ole Miss, maybe Mississippi State. Again, Mike Leach with the chaos here, or somehow with Auburn, because we've known how that game can go in a first-year head coach if Brian Harsin decides to surprise all of us. But the other 11-1 is they don't get upset. They do, but not in the same way. They get handed by A&M at Kyle Field, and A&M. The other 11-1s are Alabama still represents the SEC West in the championship game. But this 11-1 that I'm talking about, they stay home from Atlanta, and A&M instead goes, making its first trip there. But I think Alabama represents the West, and there's not much to not like besides just the lack of offensive returning starters, but the defense is loaded. Henry To'oTo'o is there now. They'll probably have the best linebacker room in the entire country. We all know how Alabama is with reloading on offense. You have John Mechie and Slade Bolden, I think, will be breakout players on the offense. Same with Bryce Young. They always have good running backs, and Saban's just going to do it again. That's what I think here. Thank you all for watching. If you liked this video, remember to like and subscribe and hit that notification bell. And my SEC championship game video will be coming out tomorrow, Georgia versus Alabama. So stay tuned for that. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you around.